Now, both federal and state and territory governments have a responsibility to protect Indigenous heritage. This is typically done through law. Around Australia, there are designated statutory authorities that are responsible for protecting Indigenous sacred sites. These statutory authorities maintain registers of Indigenous sacred sites. In the Northern Territory, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority has this responsibility. Basically, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority adhere to the NT Sacred Sites Act. They must work within the parameters of this Act. This Act, the NT Sacred Sites Act, came about after the Whitlam government came to power with the slogan, "It's time," which meant it's time for us to recognise Aboriginal people's place in Australia. And after a long struggle by Indigenous Australians and of course non-Indigenous Australians to have Indigenous people's occupation of land prior to colonisation recognised in Australia. Before, the federal and state and territory governments in Australia did develop legislation to protect cultural relics such as rock art and various types of artefacts. This was before the implementation of the Sacred Sites Act. 4 years after the Whitlam government came to power, in 1972, they passed the Commonwealth Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976. When the NT government became self-governing, became self-governing in 1978, one of the first things that the NT government did was to introduce the NT Sacred Sites Bill. Now, some of the changes that they made to the original Commonwealth Act include changing the name of the Aboriginal Sacred Sites Protection Authority to the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, and they implemented the board of the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority and ensured that there be equal gender representation on the board, including the chairperson and deputy chairperson. So of course, whenever there was a female chairperson, there would be a male deputy chairperson, etc. So equal gender representation. Now, these changes were important because Indigenous law stipulates that men and women have their own sacred sites and only they can speak for these sites. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about something called authority certificates that are also a part of the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. Now, if developers are going to carry out works on Indigenous land, they must first obtain an authority certificate. These certificates are available from the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. First, a form needs to be filled out and sent to the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. The Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority then assess the application and typically approve it if works are not a threat to nearby sacred sites, or the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority will provide applicants with provisions that they must adhere to. For example, the project can go ahead if none of the people working there take water from a particular water hole, for example. So each particular site would have, for example, specific provisions that people working on development and construction projects need to adhere to. It is important that those applying for a certificate provide as much information as possible, and is also important that they only do the works that they applied to do. If they do works that are not part of the initial certificate, they can be penalised for it. And I want to be very clear here that when companies are penalised for damaging sacred sites, they are fined. However, the fine goes to the Northern Territory government. The fine does not go to Aboriginal people. Okay, so now you know. After an application has been received by the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority contact the traditional owners of the land to determine if there are any sacred sites nearby and to protect them if the development goes ahead. When a site is registered on the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority Register of Sacred Sites, information about the site is made available to the public, and the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority can have signs erected that advise that a sacred site is nearby or that people are actually on a sacred site. The Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority is an independent statutory organisation. Really, the Sacred Sites Act and the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority have two main objectives: to protect Indigenous sacred sites and to assist Indigenous people and developers to work together. So what is a sacred site? Well, sacred sites can be anything that is natural. A hill, a water hole, a rock, etc. Not all sacred sites are the same. Some are considered dangerous, and others are only for men, and others are only for women. So basically, what a sacred site is that Indigenous people believe that their creator ancestors walked around and created the land, put people here, gave us languages, put plants and animals here, and gave us laws that we must abide with. Once they had done this, these creator ancestors became a part of the natural environment as a water hole, a rock, a tree, etc. And so this means that these creator ancestors are still there today and will always be there. And to Indigenous people, these things are seen as sacred sites. To other people, they just may be trees, they may be just a water hole, etc. But to Indigenous people, they are sacred sites and they are the homes of their creator ancestors. So really, that is what a sacred site is. The Act provides a legal definition for a sacred site and defines this as follows: a site that is sacred to Aboriginals or is otherwise of significance according to Aboriginal tradition, and includes any land that, under a law of the Northern Territory, is declared to be sacred to Aboriginals or of significance according to Aboriginal tradition. Okay, so that's the Act's legal definition of a sacred site. Now, all sacred sites have custodians. These are people responsible for looking after a sacred site. And it is important to remember here that people may be looking after a sacred site that belongs to another clan group or tribe, because this is the obligation the Creator ancestors have left them. Okay? And this creates regional harmony, all sorts of things. Okay? So groups from other tribes can have responsibilities for looking after the sacred sites of others. And these are called custodians. Now, fulfilling their obligations to look after sacred sites is very important to Indigenous people, as they believe that if they do not look after them, they can become ill and others can retaliate. So, for example, if people have an obligation to look after a sacred site and they don't do that, not only do they believe that they and their people will become sick, but other people can retaliate because some of their family may have got sick, and they will believe that that sickness has happened because the other person hasn't fulfilled their obligations as a custodian, so they can retaliate. Now, the penalties associated with sacred site damage. Well, if companies or individuals breach the Sacred Site Act, the penalty they receive is determined by a specific formula. There are different sets of fines for individuals and companies. Companies face more expensive fines. Even then, it's not really much of a deterrent, because if a large company is fined, say, $15,000, it's not really enough to deter them next time. Rightio. Now, and as I said, it's very important to point out that the money that comes from these fines goes directly to the Northern Territory government and not to Aboriginal people. Now, penalties can be for a variety of reasons, such as unauthorised entry onto a sacred site, unauthorised work on a sacred site, desecration of a sacred site, failing to abide with authority certificate conditions, unauthorised use of information about a particular place. So, for example, if people are there working and they're doing video recordings of a particular place and then they then use it in a documentary, etc. Now, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority is responsible for maintaining a register of sacred sites. However, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority do stress that the register that they have does not have all of the sacred sites in the Northern Territory. And this is because there are sacred sites out there that have just not been through the registration process yet. Now, this register of sacred sites that the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority maintain is divided into two categories: registered sacred sites and recorded sacred sites. Registered sacred sites are sites that Aboriginal people have asked the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority to protect. These sites are then documented and evaluated by the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. Recorded sites, on the other hand, are sacred sites that have been made known to the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. However, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority and the traditional owners have not been through the process to have these sites registered as yet. Okay? So again, you have registered sacred sites, and these are sites that Aboriginal people have asked the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority to protect, and these sites have been through the process of being approved as sacred sites by the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. And then there are the recorded sites, which are sacred sites that have been made known to the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority. However, the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority and the traditional owners have not gone through the process of getting those sites registered. So the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority is overseen by a board. This board consists of 5 male Aboriginal custodians. Okay, so these are people who have obligations for sacred sites. 5 female Aboriginal custodians, and 2 members that are either appointed by the Northern Territory Government or the Northern Land Council. These members are given 3-year terms on the board. However, they can be reappointed. The board get together and elect their own chair and a deputy chair. And as I said earlier, one must be a man and one must be a woman. The staff of the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority are not public servants. They are employed by the board.